Over the past 2 years, the Lattice coaches have replaced fingerboard workouts with lifting edge workouts in over 30% of our training plans. In this video, I'm going to go through the benefits and why you should and shouldn't use a lifting edge over a fingerboard. I'm going to go through lifting form and some of the workouts you could use at home. And I'm going to go through some of the really specific workouts that I use with the pros that I train. So using a lifting edge has become more and more popular over the last few years, but what are the actual benefits of using this over a fingerboard? One of the first main benefits of using an edge is that it's more controllable to train with. That means it's more precise and you can gain more benefits than training finger strength using climbing alone or even fingerboarding. This is because you can use smaller increments of weight and shoulder strength is not going to be a limiting factor. So more practical benefits are the fact it's way easier to warm up with using a lifting edge than fingerboarding. That's a little bit anecdotal, but I hear this from a lot of athletes. You can build up the weights really slowly and you can make sure that you're ready to pull harder in the session compared to hanging at body weight on a fingerboard or ramping up the weight using a hanging position. Again, another practical element is this is really transportable. Compared to your fingerboard, you can take this when you're traveling, on work trips, or even to the crag to warm up. So it means you can use the same edge day in, day out. So the main reason I prescribe using a lifting edge to the athletes that I work with is for training new grip types and recovering from injury. It's because you can keep the loads much lower and it's more controllable. We can train the specific grip types that the athletes want for their projects. It means you can improve more slowly and you can start coming back from injury by increasing the load really systematically and slowly compared to trying to hang on a fingerboard at body weight and building up from there. But in order to give you the whole picture, there are some limitations of using an edge over a fingerboard. So firstly, you've got to have quite a lot of weight if you're training with a bigger edge. So that is something that some people struggle with at home. So it's worth investing in weights if you'd like to do this at home. Secondly, some athletes have reported that it takes a little bit longer to translate finger strength from a lifting edge to the climbing wall. And that's usually down to the connection between the fingers and through the shoulder girdle to the rest of the body. But it just takes a little bit of time. And again, generally speaking, the benefits definitely outweigh that negative. To get the right lifting form, there's a couple of key things you need to keep in mind and a couple of things to avoid. So first of all, rather than lifting with the weight on your side, we're going to lift with it between your legs. It means it's going to be far more stable and you're going to be able to lift with a much more stable lower back. So with the weight in between your legs, what you're looking for is to have the weight at the right height so that you're not going to be working too much from the shoulder and you're going to be lifting from the legs. So I'm keeping a nice straight back, wide feet so the weight doesn't land on my feet, and I'm going to stand up through the legs, keeping a really steady back and the shoulder at the same height. I want to avoid lifting purely from my back because once the loads get a lot heavier, it becomes effectively a deadlift. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it's far easier to use your big muscles in your legs to do the work. The other thing I'm going to avoid is lifting with the shoulder. You usually see this when the load is too high. So the lifting pin might be too much higher off the ground. So it means I'm having to do the work from my shoulder. So I want to go up and my shoulder stays exactly the same at all times. So a couple more tips is try to avoid jolting, just because there's more chance for things to go wrong and potentially to slip or for the carabiner to move on the weight load. So you want to slightly load like you would on any lifting exercise. So you've got tension in the equipment and then pull up. So once you've lifted up, you want to lower down with relative control. It doesn't mean you have to go really slowly, but it means you have to avoid just dropping down like that. Because once again, that's going to upset the weights and it means there's more chance for things to go wrong or for it to land on your feet. So nice and controlled. So like with fingerboarding, we're going to try and avoid the fingers opening out or slipping on any of the holds. So if I lift and I can feel my hands opening out, then that means the grip position has failed and I need to lower back down to the ground. So what I tend to do is if I've lifted and the load feels heavy enough where I want to open out, I'll lower down before that happens. This is going to protect my fingers and reduce the risk of injury. The types of workout you can use are pretty much identical to fingerboarding in terms of the length and duration of isometric holds when you lift weight off the ground using a lifting edge. So you can do max hangs by lifting and holding for 10 seconds. You can do short hangs, 5 seconds, or you can do repeaters, 7 on, 3 off. The thing that stands out and is unique is the fact that you can do repetitions, so lift off the ground and drop immediately. And that's going to spike the load in your fingers up and down, which is really similar to that seen in climbing. Also, it's really satisfying to do because you're pretty much just lifting weights off the ground, which can be quite fun. When you're doing any lift repetitions, again, you can pretty much follow the basic structures of other training. So if you want to do strength training or max strength, you can do 3 to 5 lifts. If you want to look at increasing the strength endurance in your forearms, you can do more than 10 lifts in a row. Again, this is just repeating what you do in other training protocols, but doing it with a lifting edge. Let's go through 3 basic workouts that anyone can do at home. So the first workout is doing max holds. It's pretty much the same as max hangs, where you're going to be holding the weight off the ground for around 10 seconds on each arm per set. Make sure to rest between sides as well, because you will become fatigued switching sides. Now, I would look at using the maximum load in the session for around 4 to 8 sets, depending on how much you want to train in that session. Now, to understand what load to use, personally, I would use either testing or basing on RPE, which means you can kind of understand how hard you're trying personally in the moment. And usually looking for around 9 out of 10 RPE. So that means I'm trying really hard and I feel like this is a lot of effort to hold it for 10 seconds, but I feel like I could hang on for a couple more seconds if I really needed to. Just make sure when you're doing any max hangs or high loads, you have to build up over several sets to get there. So I won't start at this maximum load. I'll build up slowly and understand I'm getting closer and closer to that 9 out of 10 RPE. Once I hit that load, that's when I start working on 4 to 8 sets. So an example session for me would be, I'm going to start with 10 kilos lifting off the ground. I'm going to do a couple of sets of that. Then I'm going to increase the load to 20 kilos, a couple of sets, 30 kilos, do a couple of sets of that, 40 kilos, again, probably just 1 set of that this time. And I'm starting to get to around 7 or 8 RPE. Then I go up again to 45 kilos. Now I'm reaching that 9 out of 10 RPE where I can lift the load up. It feels controllable, but I'm trying really hard. So I'm going to do 4 to 8 sets at 45 kilos, having built up really slowly and warmed up my fingers for that. Now just remember, that's really specific to me on a certain edge depth. So you've got to find out what works for you. Session number 2 is going to be focused on lifts. So this is literally lifting the weight off the ground, and we're going to go for a more maximal load here. So we're going to do 5 lifts off the ground. We're going to rest and then repeat the same on the other arm. With the lift reps, you're looking at lifting the weight off the ground until you have straight legs, pausing for a second and lowering it back down. Pause at the bottom with it on the floor and repeat. For good form, it's also important to keep straight arms. Don't try and bend at the arm and work your bicep. It's all about the fingers. Now again, you can pretty much focus on what you did in the max hang session by building up slowly over several sets and finding that load where on the 5th rep, it feels really hard, but if you really had to, you could lift it a couple more times. Again, you want to be training around 4 to 8 sets of these lifts. The last session is going to be looking at density hangs or density holds. This is looking at building tendon stiffness like you would on a fingerboard, but using a lifting edge. And I personally think this is a much nicer way of doing it. Rather than hanging on your shoulders for 30 seconds, I'm going to be standing and holding that position. So it's really focused in on my fingers and forearms. So it's going to be a 30-second hold, again a rest, before repeating on the other side. And I'm only going to do this for 3 to 4 sets, having built up slowly. For me, at the moment, I'm doing density hangs in an open 3 grip position, which again is really comfortable for me and is training what I need, but you can focus on what grip position you want. And I think this is a really good session that you can add into your training at any point in the week because it shouldn't be too high a load, but it's a really good stimulus. personal recommendation on how to use a lifting edge from me is to superset this if you're training in a normal gym with compound lifting movements. It makes your time really efficient. When I train in a normal gym, I'll take a lifting edge and a lifting pin with me, and I'll use the weights to train my fingers whilst I'm doing other compound movements like bench press, pull-ups, or any sort of deadlift or rack pull. And this means I'm being really efficient with time, I'm getting a full body stimulus, and that means those rest periods from the compound lifts, I'm working my forearms in the right way. So in the next part of this video, I'm going to talk about what I've done with pro athletes that I work with. Now, I've replaced most finger strength training with lifting rather than fingerboarding for most of those professional climbing athletes that I work with. And we've done some really unique things in their training that's really helped them perform at the highest level in trad climbing, competition climbing, and bouldering. But just before we go through that, you've probably noticed that I'm holding this specific product. So let's just have a look at what it is. So we've just spent 18 months designing the MX Lifting Edge. There's hundreds of products on the market right now for training your fingers. So what sets this apart? So one of the first steps we took to design a lifting edge was interview the experts in the industry. That goes from everyone from athletes, coaches to physios. Whenever we create a product, we go through loads of iterations and figure out the best for that. And in the case of the lifting edge, I think we went over about 150 different types of edges before we settled on the MX Lifting Edge. And this went from everything from the weird and wonderful to pretty simple and basic. And we've ended up with something we're really happy with because of all of that testing. The last step in designing this product was to commit to doing research and collecting data. And that means doing loads of research internally with all the coaches working with their athletes, but it also means collaborating with local universities to figure out why this is the best edge. So the first interesting part about the MX Lifting Edge is the fact that it's actually curved, and that means that it loads all the fingers on the pip joint, this end joint on your finger, exactly the same across all of your fingers. So it's slightly deeper for the middle finger and ring finger than the index and pinky. We've taken this curved edge and applied it to loads of different edge sizes on two different blocks, a smaller one for people with smaller fingers and a larger one for those with larger hands. Both of the options of the MXS and the MXL edge have different size edges, so you can train with a heavier load on the larger part of the edge, and then you can train on a smaller part of the edge to get your fingers more adapted to smaller holds. If you'd like to find out more about the MX Edge or like to buy one, follow the link below. So like I mentioned before, I've been using lifting edge training with all of the professional athletes I personally work with. The reason for that is I'm trying to look for really specific gains in well-trained athletes, but this can apply to you at home as well. So one of the first things that we've started doing with a lot of the athletes is using a tin deck in combination with the lifting edge at the crag to warm up. The reason why this works is because if you know what load that you can pull against the tin deck using your phone and a sling, that means at the crag you can build up slowly and figure out whether you're ready to perform. Instead of doing a rush warm-up or doing an easy route or boulder beforehand, this gets your fingers specifically warmed up for every go that you have on the climb. So the next thing I use lifting edge for is developing specific grip positions. And for the pros that I work with, it's mostly looking at pockets and open hand positions. The reason being they're really strong on an edge and they've trained a lot on a fingerboard and an edge. But to start using pockets can feel quite uncomfortable, and when you're used to using high loads or hanging at body weight, it seems quite hard to suddenly drop back down to having barely anything going through your fingers. But using a lifting edge, there's no baseline to work on. So if I'm going to try and train mono grip positions or pockets, then I'm starting from scratch and I can build up and have a new measuring stick. Now I've done this time and time again with the athletes that I've worked with, to great effect. It's made their hands healthier, stronger, and much more well-rounded in every grip type. So if you have any standout weaknesses in a grip type, or you want to just get better at something really specific, I'd really recommend using a lifting edge to develop it. You've got no baseline to work on, so you can build up slowly. You can figure out what works for you. It means you're more robust to injury and you're going to be more well-rounded as a climber. The last and probably most unique method I've used for training professional athletes using a lifting edge is to do mono finger hangs. Now you might have heard about this a bit in media recently, and you need to be careful if you're not experienced. But in order to make professional athletes more robust to injury, and different grip types on ununiform holds. I've been training a lot of athletes using single finger monos in a half crimp position and in an open position. Now, developing this strength takes a lot of time and a lot of control. You're not looking at pushing your RPE to the highest loads, and you're not going to be hanging using that position for very long. So around 5 seconds for each finger. Developing this over several weeks, keeping the intensity really low, develops much more robustness to injury, and it can mean that you're producing far more force when you're using all 4 fingers together. Just remember, this piece of advice in particular is what I've used with professional, well-trained athletes. So use your discretion and figure out whether it's appropriate for you. I hope you found that video useful, and I can really promise this is not a gimmick. It is a tool that I'm personally using and using it with the athletes that I work with. So thanks for watching, and if you want to find out how to get hold of one of these, visit the link below.